Good morning, everyone. From the Kinnickinnick Native Plant Society, this is our November 20th meeting, and our topic today will be Scotchman's Peak Update, presented by Phil Hough, Executive Director of Friends of Scotchman's Peak Wilderness. But first, before we start the presentation, let's hear from our president, Shauna Perry, about upcoming events and our wonderful Native Plant Society membership.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate everybody coming on Zoom. It has been working really well, but we really hope to be able to get together. And the first thing on our docket is the holiday party on December 4th from 11 or 11:30 until about 2. It will be at the Sandpoint Senior Center. You all are invited. We will be conscious of the fact that we're still within COVID kind of restrictions and feelings. So we'll probably be encouraging masks until you start eating. And then that's, of course, you gotta have your mask off. But if you're uncomfortable with a potluck, which is what we're going to have, you are very welcome just to come for socializing, or you can bring your own food if you don't want to go through a potluck line. But we'd love everybody to be there and just begin to socialize a little bit more, face mask to face mask. That's it.
Great. So for today's presentation on Zoom, we're asking everyone to mute their microphones, and I think most everyone has now. And also, if you want to leave your video on, Phil would love to have to be able to see visual responses from us. So you're welcome to leave your video on if you wish. If you have questions for Phil during the presentation, just put them in the chat. We don't have a question and answer on this version of Zoom, so just use the chat function, and I will relay those to Phil when the appropriate time comes along. Where it fits into the presentation. So let me just say the Friends of Scotchman's Peak is a wonderful organization and now has 10,000 or more friends. And I'm happy to be one of those friends. And I love that wilderness area. It's beautiful on trail or off trail. It's just a gorgeous place to be. And we're so thankful to have it in our neighborhood. Let me introduce Phil first. Phil is one of the founding members of the Friends of Scotchman's Peak Wilderness, and he is also a founding member of the Idaho Trails Association and now serves on their advisory board. He's the past president of the Kinnickinnick chapter of the Idaho Native Plant Society when we were a chapter and not our own Native Plant Society. And let's see, he's a member of the Idaho Panhandle Forest Collaborative, very important group, and also the North Idaho Resources Advisory Council. And for his conservation work, Phil was awarded the Idaho Conservation League's highest award for environmental activism for his work to save the incredibly wild Scotchman's Peak. And with that, Phil, the time is yours. Welcome. I think you're muted, Phil.
I said, happy birthday, Preston.
Thank you.
I'm going to share my screen. This is going to take just a moment to set up if everybody can hang with me to get to the right mode. And I won't be able to see the chat questions. Preston will curate or moderate those. If it's something that can wait for the end, I'll let you decide if it's that or if it's something more burning. Happy to take questions during the presentation, but a lot of them may be answered. So let me get this presenter mode. And this should take a second or two to go blank and then come back.
Ooh.
And hopefully everybody sees, oops, I think we're seeing the wrong image, but not at the beginning. Let's start at the beginning. That's always the best place to start.
There we go.
All right. So what I'd like to do today, because I've presented to the Native Plant Society folks a number of times, and most people on the Zoom call here just scanning the list have a good broad familiarity with our organization and the Scotchman Peaks area and the foundations of the work that it's built on. So I'd like to really focus in on the path that we have evolved through in 16 and a half years, which has been one that I think has a really unique blend of advocacy and stewardship. Many organizations provide either advocacy or stewardship, and some combine both, but I don't think they've integrated it into their programs nearly as effectively as we have, and it's become simply a way of life for us. So one of the precepts we started with in 2005 when we came together was that we had a singular
Excuse me,
focus.
Phil, I need to interrupt you because your screen is not, your slide is not full screen at this point. We're seeing
Okay.
slide number 1 of 112.
Oh, you're
And
seeing
along
the
the
other
bottom.
way around. Well, that
We're
worked.
seeing your note screen, Phil, not your presentation screen. So just switch the monitor that's being shared.
Yeah, that's hard to do while I'm doing this. So I'm gonna have to go back. This may not work this way. I'm gonna have to do something else. So let's do this.
I think up near the top, you should have an option to switch monitors where you're, there
Not
you
when
there you
not
go.
when I'm in full screen, not when I'm in full screen mode.
Oh, gotcha.
Um, This is why we tested this, and it worked when we tested it. So
Yeah,
let's just
worked a little bit ago.
try this one more time. See if you see the correct visual. What do you see now?
It's the same as what you had before.
Okay, we're going to do a different thing.
In your note screen up near the top, there's a button that says swap displays. So when you go into presenter mode, where you're on your note screen, if you look at that screen up near the top, there's a little link that says swap displays, and then that should.
I'm not seeing it right now. If I hit presenter mode, it goes into presenter mode.
Right, but then don't you have a second monitor with your notes on it?
Yeah.
Yeah, over there, there's a button that says swap displays.
Let's see, let's try that. So hang on. No, I don't have
Yeah,
that.
upper left. Upper left, it's got end show tips, swap displays. There you
Oh,
go.
yeah, okay. It's not,
There it
it's
is.
masked. Thank you, Trish.
There we
There.
go, back
Now
on it.
everybody see nobody sees my horrid notes, do they?
No,
Thank you.
seeing your
No,
presentation
Okay.
now, this is good.
thank
Now
you,
you-
Tricia.
Sorry for the
Thank you.
delay.
Thank
So
you for your advice on that.
everybody heard the spiel I gave, though.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed. So we have a singular focus on the Scotchman Peaks and on the question of wilderness, and we don't engage in a broad swath of other conservation issues. And that was done so we could focus in on the area and do it in this really broad reach manner to try to bring in a lot of diverse interests, people who are interested in wilderness, but maybe not other things. So that was very purposeful. At the outset, and I want to dwell for a moment on our origin, enough just to say that in 2005, when we got together, a lot of the primary drivers, a lot of the people most interested, a good third of the people at our original meeting were members of the Conservation Committee of the Native Plant Society. It became one of the main focuses of the Conservation Committee, and through its early years, our organization, our board of directors, our key volunteers drew heavily upon support from the Conservation Committee. And I'm not sure everyone is aware of that as we've evolved in 16 years. So big shout out to a lot of folks on the Zoom, especially Molly O'Reilly, who was kind enough to host those meetings and provide a lot of vision at the time. Our mission, we've streamlined it a little over the years. It's really always stayed the same, but we wanted to get to the heart of the matter a couple of years ago. We wrote it to say simply to pass on a Scotchman Peaks wilderness for our children and grandchildren. We do that through a vision of bringing together people from all walks of life throughout mostly North Idaho and Northwest Montana, where over 8,000 of our 10,000 friends live. We have three main interconnected goals: to permanently protect the area through wilderness designation, the gold standard of conservation in our nation; to build a community that highly values wilderness through education and outreach and stewardship on the ground experiences. And we, in doing that, train and motivate a really diverse group of community leaders, of volunteers, and also people who are grass tops as well as the grassroots. So everybody here will know where the Scotchman Peaks lie. This is a standard part of the show because I think it really gives us a good place setting. This is northern Idaho, northwestern Montana. All of the lightly shaded green areas are Forest Service lands. The more dark green are existing wilderness areas, and the purple is the Glacier National Park. You'll notice that north of the Lochsaw River in Montana, the northern 9 counties of Idaho have 0 acres of wilderness. And in northwest Montana, there's only the Cabinet Mountain Wilderness. So if you live in the Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, Sandpoint area, your opportunities to access wilderness are fairly limited, much more so than if you say lived in Missoula. So as we look at the opportunity spectrum, it's pretty plain that we have less opportunity here for wilderness and all of the values that it brings with it. And there's conversely an opportunity to create more. There are a number of lands suitable for wilderness. There's a number of lands that have been recommended for wilderness. And when we took up the cause of the Scotchman Peaks, it was largely because it was near and dear to the hearts of several of the founding group. And it was also because it was one of the areas with the lowest level of conflicted uses, the most obvious candidate for eventual designation. What it really brings to us is this wild country in the sense that without congressional designation, it is wilderness still. It's been that way for millions of years. It's been that way through the eons. It's been sculpted by the long-term processes that nature provides. And the action of wilderness isn't that it creates a static preservation for the system as it exists now. It allows for those continued sculpting forces to take place naturally. So wilderness, simply put, is a process as much as it is a state of mind. So how do we go about building support for the wilderness area? The 3 main goals we have. The traditional methods that most nonprofits use are education, outreach, advocacy, and stewardship. And in the most part, as I alluded to at the beginning, a lot of organizations look at those as separate buckets, but over time we've come to appreciate that they're really all interconnected, and you can't effectively do one without the other. And I'll explain that a little bit better as I go throughout the presentation and provide some examples. But let's just step back and for a moment, talk about why wilderness. For a lot of folks, it's because they find their happy place there. They jump for joy here, quite literally. For President Johnson, when he signed it, or at least the speechwriter that wrote the words, when he signed the Wilderness Act in 1964, he was quoted as saying, "We must leave it as it was, a glimpse of the world as it was in the beginning." That's a very visionary statement. He's providing what is really needed for long-term wilderness preservation, a connection to this vision, to this outcome. Howard Zonheiser, who was the author of the Wilderness Act, a longtime advocate, first executive director of the Wilderness Society, was noted as having said at about that same time, "The wilderness that has come to us from the eternity of the past, we have the boldness to project into the eternity of the future." And so when we reflect on that, again, this vision of wilderness isn't about saving this particular place and time the way it is exactly now. It's about preserving that process, looking at that continuity, that legacy of wilderness. The Wilderness Act, when it first was signed, immediately put into protection about 9 million acres in 13 states and 54 unique areas, including the Cabinet Mountains Wilderness. What it also did was it provided a mechanism by where additional areas could be brought into the National Wilderness Preservation System. It provided this vision for the future that saw a wilderness system growing. That 9.6 million acres was only the start. It was the promise or down payment, if you will. Howard Zonheiser, President Johnson, many advocates of the area knew that it would grow and provided that opportunity. So there was work that was left to be done. I want to show an example of in our area, the impact of work that hasn't been done. And if the work doesn't continue and isn't completed at some point in time, we'll lose those opportunities. So focus in on 3 slides. I'll run through them fairly quick because that's the best way to see them visually. This is Northwest Montana, roadless areas in 1940. It's the first versions of the Wilderness Act were being written by Howard Zonheiser. Dark green are the roadless areas. The yellow here is the Cabinet Mountains. Keep an eye on this area. So you fast forward to 1975, somewhere between the first Roadless Area Review and Evaluation Act and the second, you can see that those dark green areas have shrunk. Roads have intruded into them. And by 1999, when the final version of the roadless rule was signed by President Clinton at the time, they've shrunk even further. This area up in here, dark green, is the Scotchman Peaks in Montana. As you can see, it's one of the last large areas of dark green that are left suitable for wilderness after this almost 50 years of road building primarily. We look at that as an opportunity, a diminishing opportunity, but an opportunity that we need to take advantage of, and we need to do so soon. And if there was a similar slide for North Idaho, it would have a similar pattern of diminishing areas of eligibility or suitability, in part because of roads, and continuing now, not so much because of road building, but conflicting uses, motorized use, the over the snow vehicles in the winter, or four-wheelers in the summer, or mountain bike. Once a constituency is established for competing uses that aren't allowed in wilderness areas, it becomes politically unviable to change that. Throughout the time we started until just a few years ago, we worked on the forest plan to get a strong recommendation for it. Wilderness is about more than those recreational opportunities that are defined motorized or mechanized. It's a high value ecosystem. In our area, the Native Plant Society here is very involved with a lot of activities that make abundantly aware. We have this wet maritime system moving in from the Pacific. I think we saw that this week and last week. We have lower elevation mountains for the Rockies, really the northern edge of the Northern Rockies ecosystem and the southern edge of the Canadian Boreal system. And so that's the short wonky talk on. We have a convergence of zones that brings thousands of species of flora and fauna that are unique to the area, that have many different manifestations here that aren't found throughout the West. That's an ecological argument. If we want to connect the community to wilderness and the value of wilderness, we are most effective at doing that through their hearts. Terry Tempest Williams wrote, "If you know wilderness in the way that you know love, you would be unwilling to let it go." When you think about that or lean into that and just feel that, what she's really saying is that if we love wilderness, if we find the reasons why we love wilderness, we will then fight for it. If it's just this headspace up here theoretical argument, it's not as passionate, and we don't get supporters who are as likely to turn out as volunteers or as strong advocates when the time is right. And so we've focused a lot, especially in the last few years, on bringing in those heartfelt connections. We've, over the last several years, asked for people to provide testimonials about how they find their wild place or what they find in their heart. And for many, it is their first experience on or close to the summit of Scotchman Peak. We get a lot of unsolicited photos from this very, very photogenic backdrop as you're about a half mile away from the summit. I would guess probably half the people on this call have a photo of themselves in this spot. For Ron and Laura Forsberg, who are active with Trout Unlimited, they believe that there are areas where nature is still allowed to run its course are really important to them. And they're fly fishermen, and there's a little bit of fly fishing on the edges of the Scotchmans, but the idea of keeping ecosystems intact for their use, for hunting, for fishing, again, for just the ecological integrity of corridors and preserved areas. We have a high school essay contest every year, again, where we talk about outreach and education culminating in advocacy. And Ryan Goodman, a couple years back, was our overall contest winner from Libby. He loves to hunt on non-motorized trails and pick huckleberries during the late fall months and snowshoe in the winter. And making sure we are connecting the next generation of local students, stewards of the lands, is really important. Rebecca Sanchez, you might recognize her children. They frequently grace our media presence. The cover of our newsletters have been frequently one of her 3 children, and she homeschools them once a week, year round. She takes her kids on backcountry adventures, oftentimes in the Scotchman Peaks, but almost always to some wild, rugged place, because as she puts it, she loves how their kids are when they're free and allowed to roam and explore on their own. The connections that they make to each other as a family and to the land are really important to her. And it's those connections that we want to foster, and we want to make sure there are areas that are available for families, both now and into the future, for their children. So we bring this together on under an umbrella of programs we call stewardship. For a lot of people, stewardship with a conservation organization means you're building trails, and we do some of that. And you'll see people with Pulaskis that are clearing water bars and rehabilitating trails, but we also do a whole lot more with that. We provide personal connections to the landscape. We've done, and I'll roll through some of the programs pretty quickly. A number of things which have included a number of volunteers from the Native Plant Society. We look at the wildlife education we do, our Mountain Goat Ambassador program, where we're letting people know really you need to leave the goats alone, as a valuable part of stewardship. We've looked at the citizen science studies we've done with the carnivore study a few years back that was very important as well. We look at things like simply taking people out on hikes where they can make connections and we can build advocates as being a way of stewarding the area as we build the advocates for it that are necessary for its protection. Youth education, our winter tracks program in, well, the winter, brings students in and connects them to wilderness values and skills and qualities. And through that, again, develop the youth interest in the area that provides for good stewardship. So they're all really interconnected. Let's roll through a few of these. Hopefully everybody has signed up for at least one of our hikes, summer or winter, in the past. If not, do so. We always offer them both seasons. We take a little bit of a break in the mud season, spring and fall. We've had some specific hikes arranged for groups like the Transition in Progress, who were kids in a battered mother's shelter who don't have much access to the outside. We did that for several years. Good. One more slide. A few years back, we had a special hike with our county commissioners, two of them at the time, who were very active supporters, and Kerry Kelly, actually, he made this sign himself, saying Bonner County loves Scotchman Peaks, and we had him and Glenn Bailey hike to the top and unfurl that in the lead up to the eventual bill that was introduced by Senator Risch. We do the traditional skills because we want to train people in the art of the crosscut saw and the Pulaski, so that there are a core of volunteers with the skills and interest and connections to provide that level of stewardship once the area is wilderness. We will train people on that. Don't have to have any experience. We will train you. We had this aha moment about 11 years ago when a big windstorm impacted the Scotchman Peak Trail itself. A number of old growth trees came down and the Forest Service needed some help to get it cleared in time for the season. We had planned for 4 days of volunteers turning up to help them out over 2 weekends. And we had so many people turn out the first day, we got it all done then. And it was at that moment where we realized that, hey, we've got some pent up demand. People want to do something to help the area while we're working on this wilderness designation question. So we launched a formal program of trails work in the summer of 2011, and we hired our first backcountry wilderness ranger, an intern, to help lead projects and help suss out the area during the midweek and really gain some experience. College students who are doing a summer internship who will get credit for their focused studies on everything from biology to recreation management. This year, we had Patrick Shea, who's on the left here, with another group's intern on the right, doing a crosscut saw demonstration over in Thompson Falls. It's the way we connect the stewardship with the outreach so that folks can see and understand the skills and hopefully get a little turned on by the crosscut saw. It really sings quite nicely when it's in its performance state. We go out to the backcountry, of course, with the saws, and we frequently clear trails because we have a lot of trees. We grow trees really well here, and that means occasionally those trees come down, and occasionally hillsides come down, and we've rerouted the upper part of the Morris Creek Trail this summer to go away from the cliff that fell off the face of the earth a few years back. So it's now safe to go beyond mile 4. Hand digging with Pulaski is about a 1/4 mile of new trail over 3 days. We encourage parents to bring their children to our training days and encourage them to bring them out on some of the stewardship projects we need to train the next generation. And while we're talking about training, we train in CPR. I hope everyone recognizes Carol Jenkins and knows that she is certified to train Red Cross Wilderness and Remote First Aid and has done classes for us over the last 6-7 years. And to date, we have certified over 75 individuals in Wilderness Remote First Aid. It's a 2-day course. We used to offer it for free, but we do ask that the students cover the cost of the registration itself from Red Cross in the handbook. It's about $60. In return, all we ask is that they provide 2 days of volunteer service. If you went to Red Cross or Knowles and got similar training, it would be $250 to $300. So it's a really great value. It's a great service we're able to provide because Carol donates her time and in service to us to train folks. Put the slide in here because the wilderness experience isn't all about trails, and it's not always about, that one's got an auto timer on it, and it's not always about building bridges. Wilderness experience is about taking the landscape as it exists, and having those unbridged crossings, I think, really define the wild character of many places. We have a non-conforming use in a way in Star Peaks Lookout. The Wilderness Act does provide for historical purposes. It's been interpreted in some areas to allow these structures and some not. We know that the Star Peak Lookout and the Stone Cabin, which is the oldest building on the Kootenai, built by Gordon Granville back in 1907, has high value to the community. And so were an act to be written for Montana, would likely include wording that would allow for at least the continued presence of these buildings under certain conditions. And to that end, and here's a shot of the early days of the Lookout Cabin where people stayed and supplies stayed. To that end, the Forest Service wanted to stabilize it a few years ago. It was deteriorating, and the way to do that in wilderness is not with helicopters and ATVs, but the 9 Mile Mule team out of Montana came and offered their assistance, and students from Missoula came up, and between the two, we got the lumber hauled up mountain. And a 4-legged volunteer got his volunteer hat. The only way you can get the volunteer hat is to volunteer. When we really started shifting focus from trails to other forms of stewardship, one of the things we did was some white pine planting on the area just outside of the Scotchman Peaks proposed wilderness. In the area surrounding the roadless area, up the old road up Lightning Creek was being rehabilitated, excavated, and recontoured. Kevin Davis wanted to plant white pine seedlings, and so myself, Jim Mellon, Jim Dubison, Sandy Mellon's dog, hauled 3,000 seedlings up 9 miles of road and planted those. And I'm happy to report I've been back there as recently as this summer, and it's 9 years, 10 years since we've planted those, and some of those white pines are doing really well. Of course, some of them succumb to blister rust or other things, but there are now some that are 10, 12 feet tall. So it's nice to see the regeneration happening even just in our lifetimes. We had another aha moment in 2010 and entered a few months later, the winter 2010 and 11, into a partnership arrangement with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game to do a rare carnivore study, focusing on wolverines, fisher, marten, and lynx. Michael Lucid, the non-game biologist for Idaho Fish and Game at the time, came to me and suggested that he had set up camera stations in the Selkirks and gotten some interesting images and wanted to do the same in the West Cabinets and the Scotchmans, but didn't have the manpower. He had the cameras, but not the manpower. So we talked to a few people and got them out there. And within just a couple months, we had set up 4 stations and had a lot of enthusiasm for it. And so the next year we wrote a grant, got more cameras of our own, and broadened our portion of the study area to about 40 stations and had a tremendous turnout of interest. And it was just fabulous to see people so interested in actions they could take to help further the knowledge for wildlife that underscores a lot of management plans. Plus, we got great images of things like the fisher. Again, primarily focusing in on wolverines, fisher, marten, and lynx. We had a lot of images of a lot of other animals that were of interest to Idaho Department of Fish and Game. The red fox, which is not often seen in this area. Flying squirrels, who knew they were carnivorous? Who knew that they were this present on the landscape? Of the 41 stations, we had images of flying squirrels at more stations than we had images of any other animal at stations. Of course, it's hard to talk about wildlife studies and the big cats without showing an image of the lynx. This was caught on camera up in the Purcells, just a little north of our area. Well-documented area for the lynx there. We caught this first image of a bobcat. It was an overnight media sensation. We were our first viral Facebook post with this bobcat. Within a 24-hour period, it was seen by thousands and thousands of people. The project benefits an awful lot of things. And after 4 years of study, we had enough data that Idaho Fish and Game said no more. They had enough for their state wildlife action plans. The Forest Service had information they could use during the forest planning, during winter travel planning. one of the really interesting things we found that was most pertinent to our area of interest was that Fisher had thought to have been extirpated from the West Cabinets. And over the course of 4 years, we documented at least 30 unique individual Fishers living in the West Cabinets, an established reproducing population. And that's assisted with certain land swaps transfers at the north end of the West Cabinets that help provide connectivity between the West Cabinets and the Yak. Plus, we get to go out and play like Wolverines. John Harbuck loves to climb trees, and what better excuse than to go set up a base station high that won't be covered in the winter. And we got to engage students. We took groups of students out from various local high schools. This is from the Lake Padre Alternative School. They're snowshoeing in to check the gun brushes on a station, and then we would go back into the classroom and talk about what we found after collecting the camera later. All of this energy and interest from volunteers, over 300 volunteers during the 4 years, and we had 24 cameras and nothing to do with them then in the 5th year when Fish and Game said no more. So we created our youth education, which we call Winter Tracks, and focused it around some of the things that were discovered during this process. So we'll take students out and do 4 modules usually, and oftentimes I'll include a tracking class or a mock setup of a camera base station. We do tree identification. We do a host of other things. Jeff Pennick, a retired silviculturist from the Forest Service, and Ed Robinson, who's retired from the Department of Lands, have teamed up and done almost every tree ID class for the last 5 years in Bonner County. Ed, many of you know, is also an accomplished plein air artist. His art is hanging today at Evans Brothers. He had a show opening last night, and it features many great shots or paintings of the Scotchman Peaks area. Celeste Grace and Mary Frenzel will talk about mammals. They do most of our Bonner County tracks classes. We have our own mammals trunk that we'll use outside, or sometimes resources from Round Lake State Park like this. One of the great things about the youth education and partnering with schools is we know we're getting a cross section of everyone who lives in Bonner County, at least those who go to the public school system. So the kids are carrying home these values with them to their families, and that's so important. And we also develop really strong relationships with teachers who are really important members of the community too. And so having Becky Haig from Clark Fork talk about how fortunate she feels it is for her class to have the access to knowledgeable volunteers has been something that's really been gratifying. And a lot of the knowledgeable volunteers who have populated our youth education programs have been people from the Native Plant Society here. I'll call out Preston because I know he's been out a few times, and George Gehring has signed in. He's helped out as well. And I hate to start mentioning people because I know that I'll miss someone. Last year during COVID was a hard time to be doing hands-on education with students. Classes were in our area not locked out at home, but they were limiting visitations and field trips. So we produced a hybrid hands-on experience by putting together our great outdoor activity boxes and sending them to schools the week beforehand so they could make plaster molds of tracks, they could plant seedlings, they could make a compass and do things that were interactive, and then have a Zoom session where they could interact through chat and ask questions about what was happening with each of those projects. And so we did this hybrid Zoom online hands-on thing that sort of worked. It was better than nothing, and the teachers really appreciated the activities, and it kept enthusiasm going. And towards the end, we were able to get one outside class in for Segal Elementary School, masked up and socially distanced and fully vaccinated, volunteers at least. The mammals trunk, as I mentioned, for our Winter Tracks module, we've taken to many fairs and festivals, and how the elementary schools stream night, and our attempt during the summer at doing something with adults through the Sandpoint City Park and Rec, our family fun in the forest. But at many other places we brought this. We've also turned to field trips that focus on specific topics. In this case, fire ecology. After the fires burned in 2015, we had a great chance in 2016 to go back and look at where the process of regeneration was starting. It's a great way to integrate our partners. This is Doug Bradatich, a senior manager with Idaho Forest Group, taking kids out at Round Lake on a field trip. These are kids up from the Pioneer School in Spokane, and for us to be able to connect him and the students and the tree identification and his love for the forest is something that really has helped, I think, grow the partnerships approach that we've had. Our Trail Ambassador program, I think many people are familiar with it, and it started in 2015 when we had an unfortunate incident with a goat getting too close to a photographer who was trying to lure it in, and the goat nicked the photographer in the back of the leg, and 17 stitches later, the trail was closed to hikers for 8 months. So over that winter, when it was closed, I got together with Eric Walker, district ranger at the time. We talked about what can we do to keep it open? What can we do to reopen it and keep the trail open? And we focused first in on the education aspect as something the friends could contribute to. And so our goal is to keep the mountain goats wild, so that through education, we can make sure people are behaving correctly so that the goats behave correctly. Hikers safe. Clearly, we don't want or need hikers getting gored or hooked in a horn by a goat. And the trail's open. No one wants the trails closed, and no one wants to see the goats removed lethally or otherwise by fishing game. So those are the three main objectives. We do that because, if folks aren't familiar, goats really like salt. They are not necessarily the friendly creatures you think they are. They're salt addicts. And so they'll come up and try to lick you. And even people who know better will hold out a hand and encourage them because they think that this is something like a safe petting zoo. But goats are wild animals, as wild and unpredictable and defensive as a bear. And as a volunteer cartoonist drew for us, you wouldn't let a bear lick your legs, would you? So don't let a goat lick your legs. And put that on the posters and tried to educate people. And we did some social media work and some print media work and signs on the trail to reinforce the message. And we found that these things were helpful, but they weren't really getting to the heart of the matter. So what we did was put together this program to place volunteers out on the trail. The beauty is they can hike all the way to the top, or they can sit at the trailhead as long as they get there reasonably early and interact with as many hikers as possible. We have them go out on Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays from early June through early October and talk to people. And over the last 6 years, we have settled into doing about 25 to 30 days a summer, usually with about 35 to 40 ambassadors. A lot of them go out in pairs. And we've talked to over 1,000 hikers each summer. So we know we're getting to people where they're at with the information they need at the time. We've also been able to document trail usage, and it has spiked since COVID hit. In the last 2 summers, we've seen quite an increase in usage of the namesake trail, the Scotchman Peak Trail. I don't think Carol's logged on, but that's her grandson, Kurt. Not our youngest trail ambassador. We did have baby Larson, 2 years old, go up. But Kurt's old enough, we gave him a pair of loppers and let him help clear a little trail. I'll tell you, if you've worked with volunteers, no one has as much energy towards clearing brush as an 11-year-old. They are genuinely having fun. Amongst the rewards, I would just say sign up early so you can get one of the coveted mid to late August dates on the Scotchman Peak Trailhead. And if you know where to look, there are plenty of huckleberries, even on a trail that's so heavily used. Quick shout out to our partners for this program. It was really important that we had support from Idaho Fish and Game, and they do provide training through Laura Wolf and the Forest Service we interact with on a regular basis to monitor the usage. And the Idaho Master Naturalists has been a good source of volunteers. There's a heavy overlap with Idaho Master Naturalists and the Kinnikinnick Native Plant Society. We had funding this summer because of the recognition increased use from COVID provided an immediate need for education on our public lands. We had one-time funding from the National Environmental Education Foundation and the Innovia Community Foundation. And it's support like that that really helps us build the capacity to make programs like this possible. So I want to step back a moment in time to our Treasured Landscapes program, which happened from 2012 to 2016, spearheaded by the National Forest Foundation. They designated 14 treasured landscapes across the country. The Lightning Creek drainage was one of them. We were one of the primary partners coordinating volunteer activities. And I say coordinating because we heavily engaged the Idaho Master Naturalists, the Kinnikinnick Native Plant Society, and to some degree the Backcountry Horsemen. And in a moment, you'll see why specifically the Native Plant Society and Master Naturalists were so engaged. The program had really 3 or 4 mainstays: a white bark pine restoration process, some weed monitoring, and trails access. And so This is a map that's not at great scale to see detail, but many people are familiar with the Hope Peninsula. And so the B-top Round Top area and the Scotchman Peaks. The kind of mustardy yellow part are areas of predicted good habitat for whitebark pine. We surveyed most of those with the Forest Service, over 25 miles of trail and 3,000 acres. And what we surveyed for were the presence of blister rust and, more importantly, the presence of trees that appeared to be resistant to blister rust. So we were looking for those trees that were mature enough to be seed trees, making notes on habitat that might be useful for applying prescribed burning to improve the habitat. And for rare plants, there were several specific species of high alpine rare plant that the local botanist Jennifer wanted to look for. So she helped train and we helped to deploy volunteers over the course of several multi-day backcountry trips to get up into the areas and have enough time to properly explore them. This required, or at least was heavily benefited by the use of bringing in materials through the backcountry horsemen. And in a lot of cases, just going and hiking. Afterwards, we followed up with some direct seed sowing, as well as seedling planting, and the Forest Service started the process of collecting cones. Volunteer task for everyone. On Scotchman Peak, it was harder for the backcountry horsemen to deploy, so we had water Sherpas carrying 40 gallons of water up to a campsite that we could use for multiple days. Again, quick rundown. As I mentioned, over the course of the 4 years, we had 25 unique volunteers doing habitat surveys on 35 miles of trails. I think that was our weed monitoring, and the 25 square miles of whitebark pine habitat. Weed monitoring, Derek Cantonelli looking at a thistle that's taller than he is, an invasive one. And so we went out and monitored 8 trails, 45 miles for weeds. Ken Thacker and Bonnie Jacobus put together our weed guide specific to the Scotchman Peaks West Cabinets, but really it could be most broadly applicable to anything in Bonner County. And so it's a handy field guide for folks who went out on our weed monitoring trip. So I want to turn to collaboration, which is in this mix of things, less directed at stewardship and more as how do we bring everything together and move forward, getting a bill done. And we know we need to involve a broad set of stakeholders on issues besides the Scotchmans, but the Scotchmans are our focus. And so to get Senator Rich to reintroduce a bill, we know that it will need more components. Collaboration is a tool used by many these days. In some areas, it's treated as if this is a new discovery, but reflecting on Frank Church and the legacy he has left for wilderness, he was noted in a field hearing as having said, as I work for wilderness, I work also for more efficient forest management, because the only way we could fashion an adequate wilderness system is as part of a well-balanced resource management program for the entire country. And so Frank Church was advocating for this over 50 years ago. The Friends sits in a group with the intention on the Panhandle of coming up with collaborative approaches to the landscape, Panhandle Forest Collaborative. We also work in Montana with the Kootenai Forest stakeholders. In 2010, as the forest plan was under consideration, the group, the Forest Projects Committee was at the point of bringing together 10 individual signees from 5 timber companies and 5 environmental conservation groups around a common set of proposals for the forest plan that included wilderness proposals for the Scotchman Peaks, the Mallard Larkins, Selkirk Crest, and Sallow Priest, and included recommendations for certain timber guidelines. On the Kootenai, we're doing something very similar that most people here are on the periphery of, but we're engaged with the Kootenai Forest Stakeholders Coalition, who have a similar landscape approach to providing for joint support for both timber guidelines as well as wilderness designations. Together, that culminated in a strong Forest Service recommendation in 2015. As that plan was coming out, the record of decision, we went back to Washington, D.C. with Kate McAllister, President of the Chamber of Commerce, to talk with our elected officials about the possibility of introducing a bill. And at about that time, the final hearings on the Boulder White Clouds bill were being conducted. So we had the chance to sit in and observe that and talk with Senator Risch about his intentions to do something with the Scotchman Peaks, which he announced during this hearing, and a year later did introduce a bill. And so about that time, Carrie Kelly from our Bonner County Commissioner office, conservative Republican, Bob Bay from Idaho Force Group, I went back to again work on the prospects of doing that with Senator Risch and of course meeting with the rest of the delegation. Most everyone on the call knows the bill was introduced. This is where our passionate volunteers really come to the forefront as passionate advocates, sometimes working more than one phone at a time. Celeste has been a great mainstay on many of our volunteer programs, and she would be an advocate regardless, but a very passionate one as she's been hands-on with so many things. We also collected support from all of the partners we've been working with. You'll see here, the print's not too fine. We had 6 or 7 former county commissioners, including conservative Republicans, let us use their name and support on a postcard advocating for the passage of this bill, along with many other people representing a broad slate of interests. One of the interesting things, though, the bill didn't pass, but there were 4,800 people who voted in favor of it. There were only 1,000 Democrats that voted in that primary, which means 3,800 votes, or a margin of almost 3 to 1, were people in support of the bill who were either Republicans or independents. And so when we talk about broad political support, it really truly is there. This vote was pretty thin. I don't think it was an accurate reflection of the level of support. That said, Senator Risch has made it clear that it will take more time and more patience to craft a bill to move forward. And so we're working on that. There are efforts being made now to bring together a broader stakeholders coalition to look at legislative prospects for North Idaho. And it's a little premature to comment on exactly where that will go, but if the Scotchman Peaks focus alone is insufficient to build the support Senator Risch needs, then a broader landscape may offer the opportunities for additional wilderness protections, along with something that will allow for some certainty, if you will, or ability for certainty for motorized recreation, mountain bikes, so they know where wilderness boundaries will be and won't be. There may be something we can do with the timber guidelines too. The details are premature. As I said, we focus in on the Scotchman Peaks portion, but we're interested in engaging those other stakeholders in conversations that would hopefully lead to something that is more closely aligned with the package of proposals put together by the Kootenai Forest stakeholders that's out there as well. And so these will all take into account some of the major interests across our landscape. Meanwhile, we continue with the stewardship work and the program work to build support for the wilderness components. So that once the bill goes forward, we have a robust group of voices who are supporting wilderness. I'm hopeful that everyone on this Zoom call is already signed up to get our 3 times a year Peak Experience newsletter, either through the snail mail or through email. And hopefully a number of people, at least those who are interested in volunteer activities and events, are signed up for our weekly insider. If not, it's easy to do both. You can go online and use our subscribe feature. It's fast, it's safe, it's secure. We don't share that list with anyone else. It's too hard fought, so you won't get spammed. And sign up today. Before we end, I do want to point out, if you haven't discovered our Your Wild Place, our new podcast, we started this when the COVID hit, and we wanted to have something more online. We've got a wonderful collection of audio essays now, 1.5 years worth up. We have some fabulous ones planned coming up. It's really easy to find. Anywhere you listen to podcasts, you can put in Your Wild Place and it should pop up, or you can go to our website. So before we take questions, I will be remiss to not note that it's mid to almost Thanksgiving November, which means we're rapidly approaching year end, which is a really important time for all nonprofits. It's when a lot of folks make their annual contribution, or if they're able to be generous, make a second contribution. It's really important for nonprofits to raise funds during the end of the year as we head into the new calendar year, to have good planning around what our capacity is. And so if you haven't donated this year, now's your opportunity. Anytime between now and the end of the year, we'd appreciate your support. Again, fast, easy, free. Use the donate button on the website, or feel free to send a check to the office. And happy to answer any questions about that or any other questions that have come up in chat, or you might be thinking of now.
Great. Thank you. Phil, thank you. I think our group is small enough. I do see a question here. Let's see. This is from,
I'm going to stop sharing the screen then. If I
and you can look at the chat, I guess, then.
yeah, let me just
And this is,
segue out here. It'll take a second.
yeah,
My screen goes dark.
I think it's a comment from Paul. Ricky.
Let me see. Let me pull up chat. Hang on. Okay. There's a screen. Okay. Can everybody see the chat that Paul's typed in?
Yes.
Okay. So I would disagree with the first sentence. I wouldn't say clearly collaboration doesn't work, but I don't think this is the best time or place to get into a debate regarding that. And the area that we're looking at and the potential for legislation would be almost certainly not directed towards a national park area. There's been a lot of robust conversation about wilderness and the intersect with indigenous tribes. And what I have to say is that is we've met with the Kootenai tribe of Idaho, which they have their reservation in Bonners Ferry. And we've met with them and their staff since 2007 and have a good working relationship with them. And as an indigenous people, and this is the case of most tribes, they view their role in natural resource management as that of a sovereign nation. So they work one-on-one, their government to our government. And so the conversations they tend to have with us and we have with them, we keep them informed about what we're doing, we solicit their input. But when it comes to sitting in a collaborative group, sometimes they'll be there to listen. They'd like to be kept informed. We've assured them we'll keep them informed of anything going forward. And then they want to have those conversations, usually with our senators' offices. They're the ones who have the capacity to interact with them that way. We've also had conversations with the Kootenai Salish tribe in Montana and with the Kalispel tribe, mostly through their staff, and a little less so, but to some degree with the Coeur d'Alene tribe. And in the case particularly of the Scotchman Peaks, back away from the lake, the tribe that seems to be most interested in management plans are the Kootenai tribe of Idaho. And to answer your question about, I'm unaware that they want all federal lands back in Bonner County, but that's, a matter that they would take up with Bonner County or Boundary County rather, or with the federal government. That's not a position I've heard their tribal chair or staff, or they have a lawyer who represents them on a lot of panels, Billy Barkman suggests before. But
Okay. Thanks, Phil. Is there other questions for Phil? I have one I can ask if people could unmute.
Can
People
I
could-
just unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, please
Since
do.
it's so-
Yeah, of course you can. And anyone else can ask by unmuting.
First of all, Phil, great presentation. I mean, it's pretty awesome. All the things that have, gone, all the things that have been done around the Scotchmans. So I'm kind of like Paul. I'm kind of curious about I refuse to call it the Buckskin Saddle Restoration Project. I call it the Green Monarchs Logging Project. It's just shocking when I found out about it when I got back from the Willawas. And I want to know why your participation in Forest Collaborative supported this really horrible project. As you were going through your slideshow, I was thinking of all those beautiful scenics over the lake and all of those green mountains being logged and clear cut.
yeah,
So I want to know.
So
I haven't had a chance to call
Sure.
yet.
Yeah. So I want to start with, I wouldn't describe it as a horrible project, and I don't think that's an accurate way or position to frame it. So I would just disagree from the outset at that outcome. I know that there's
125
Oh.
miles of road or
Yeah, no,
12,000
so-
acres.
So it's not 125 miles of road. There's a lot of misinformation out there about it. And I would need to pull up the project record to go through all of the details, but I would just suggest that some of the media work that's been done on that contains factual errors. And then is misrepresentative of an awful lot of the impacts of the area. So there's a lot in that project record, and if someone's really interested in it, I'd suggest that they dig into it because there's been, at best, some benign misrepresentation of it, and at worst, I'd say some actual misleading of statements and facts surrounding it. So I know.
Did you read Aries
Yes.
editorial?
I read Barry's piece, and again, I would stand by my statement. There's some factual misrepresentation in that article, and I'm not.
So
here
could you
today to
just-
I don't think the purpose of today's presentation is to debate the buckskin saddle project, and if
No,
that's,
but my question is why did the Scotchman's Peak support it?
so the answer to your question is we signed on through the Panhandle Forest Collaborative. The Panhandle Forest Collaborative supported it. We were one of the signees to that. It's because I believe the project actually does some good restoration work on the landscape. It has desired outcomes that are in alignment with the forest plan, and it works towards those in a meaningful way. It's not a perfect project, but it is not nearly as destructive as Barry has made it out to be. And again, I don't think we should co-opt this presentation with a debate regarding the buckskin saddle project.
No, it's just an opportunity to ask a question that I think is really
Sure.
one of the most crucial
And
forest plans on the.
if I knew we were going to discuss this, I'd have prepared a fact sheet to counter or refute the things Barry had, but I haven't prepared that fact sheet, so I would hate to go in and cite statistics here. But I would say that the statistics and statements in his article are at best misleading, and at worst, I think that they are just factually in error, whether that's knowingly done or not. But
Well, here's a suggestion, and then I'll mute myself.
so
Perhaps it would be good to respond to this and point out the factual errors, because there are a lot of people talking about this. There's the Inlander now working on a major story about it.
Yeah.
So
So
I just, I
we are-
asked Waterkeeper
Yeah.
question, so.
we are one of 30 members of the Panhandle Forest Collaborative, and I will forward that on to the collaborative for their consideration. But, again, I would just suggest to those listening in who are not familiar with the conversation here or familiar with the project details to dig into it a little more. There's a lot of information out there in the project record that is different than what is being suggested by Barry. As a general umbrella statement, I'd say the project's objectives are good. While not perfect, it goes a long ways towards meeting them, and that there are things in it that I wish I could change, but in totality, it's not a bad project for the landscape. It does a
Well,
lot of
I
good restoration work.
agree.
Yeah.
I disagree wholeheartedly.
You asked my
So,
question, my
thank you.
opinion, I'm offering it, so.
Thank
Phil, I have a more of a biological question here. The light or the Trestle Creek Complex fire from this summer, did that have any impact on the white bark pine habitat in the Lightning Creek area that you had showed where there had been planting, or has there been surveys yet done on that?
From this summer, I know that they were doing some of the assessment work post-fire, and I haven't seen the results of that assessment work. And so I couldn't tell you how much they impacted it, but for the most part, the Trestle Creek fire this summer didn't intrude much on the study area. There was a fire back in 2017 along the B-top ridge line that impacted more of it. And of course, there were the 2015 fires in the Scotchman Peaks drainage just to the east of Scotchman Peak itself. And that actually, that impacted the area, but in fact, it burned over about half of the area that was going to be prescribed burn. So it simply accelerated what the Forest Service was going to do. It provided the ecological service to the area that fire should. And so, again, looking at how we talk about fire, it's not all bad. In the case of the 2015 fire, provided some good benefit. I haven't heard from the Forest Service about the value benefit of the 2017 fire or the one this year, but in general, I will say the early reports are that they both burned in a very mosaic-like fashion, that the understory was overly developed, if you will, and that's what fires do. They help move out some of the understory materials. So they make the area more resilient to large scale fires in the future, and they provide some ecological good. And so it's important to look at, when we talk about impact, not just immediately assume that it's a destructive impact that we're measuring. It's also sometimes a positive one.
Absolutely, thank you. My Patty has a question for you about, do any of the current bills going through Congress have any impact on the Scotchman's Peak wilderness?
Nothing directly. There's no bill entered into Congress right now that directly has an impact. Of course, congressional policy always has the potential to influence conservation efforts. And so, simply put, things like the Build Back Better plan, and I have not read through all of it, but I understand, for example, that it contains funding mechanisms that will potentially assist trails and potentially assist the Forest Service with some of their restoration work, and that directly or indirectly can benefit the Scotchman Peaks. So there are important elements of that bill, and they're still unpacking what exactly is in the bill that was just passed, the infrastructure bill. It's still unclear how that will impact things, but overall, both of those bills together will provide some additional monies to the agency and potentially to partner groups. How that gets parsed out is uncertain at this point.
I'm thinking of isn't the proposed Climate Conservation Corps, that might give some resources.
Yeah, it's possible. It's unclear yet, where that will go and how that will develop.
Thank you.
Certainly possible.
Other questions for Phil, either in the chat or unmute? And everybody's happy with the presentation. Was awesome, Phil. Just
Thank
awesome.
you.
Beautiful pictures and great overview, and activities that are going on and are going to continue to go on with the Friends of Scotchman's Peak Wilderness. So, anybody else have questions? I think no, somebody else wants to come back in. Somebody went out and then come back in. I guess we probably are through. Phil, thank you so much.
All right.
I hope everybody has a great day, and I'll go enjoy the rest of my birthday.
All right. Happy birthday.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. We'll be back next year in January with programs.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.